Hello, friend. Are you trying to figure out how to increase your motivation? If so, I think it could be useful to think about the ways in which our environment are connected to our behavior and our motivation. If you watched the video that I did called Understanding Motivation 1, then you know that I tend to describe motivation as an emotion, and emotions change all the time based on our situation. And if we look at our situation holistically, we can consider what's happening in our body, what's happening in our mind, and what's happening in our life or in our environments. Now, we can't separate out those things. They're all connected. And so environment influences behavior and motivation because it can influence what's happening in our body and what's happening in our mind. Now, I want to make a little bit of a connection with you for behavior, thinking, and feeling. And I've made this point before, but what is happening in our body physically affects how we feel or our mood. Our feeling and our mood affects how we think, and our thinking affects what we do. And so when we think about motivation, we often go straight to behavior and we focus on what we want to do. But what we do is connected to how we think, how we feel, and what's going on in our body. And so that's why environment can be an important element of motivation because it can affect our body and our mind. Okay, so there are 4 ways that I think environment can influence us. And it is physically, chemically, emotionally, and behaviorally. And so we'll talk about each one of those things a little bit now. From a physical perspective, 2 words tend to pop in my mind: pain and posture. Okay, so first with pain. This is very straightforward, but if we have to be in environments that cause us pain, it will tend to decrease our motivation. As an example, if you have to sit at a desk for 8 hours a day, and at the end of the day, your back is in pain, your knees are sore, your hips are achy, you're going to feel a lot less motivated to go to the gym, to walk around the block, or to do any movement activity. Another thought about pain and movement: if you wear high heels and you go to a dance or a party and you dance your butt off, the next day, if your feet are sore, you're probably going to feel less motivated to walk, run, or exercise. And so this seems like a pretty straightforward connection, that if something about our environment causes us to feel pain, that pain will decrease our motivation to do certain behaviors. But pain is something that will decrease our motivation to do everything. And I want to think about a behavior that most people say they're pretty motivated to do, and that's cuddling with their boo. Okay, so most people, you ask them, how motivated are you to cuddle with your boo? And they say, oh, I'm super motivated. But if you are in pain, generally speaking, your motivation to do things just goes way down. And so if pain can decrease our motivation to do something like cuddling with our boo, then it makes sense that physical pain will decrease our motivation to do everything else. Okay. In addition to affecting us from a pain perspective, our environment can put us in different postures, and different postures can affect our motivation. I mentioned this again in another video, but when we're standing, our energy is of one quality. When we sit, our energy changes, and when we lie down, our energy changes even further. And so if we're in a hammock or laying on a sofa, that's part of the environment that we're in, and our energy and motivation to do things will be a certain way when we are in that type of posture. So that's all I want to say about physical. Now I want to move on to talk about how our environments can affect us chemically. Okay. So we sometimes forget that our bodies are big biochemical factories. And I don't want to talk about every hormone and enzyme and chemical process in our body. I just want to kind of briefly think about 2 things, and it is air and light. So when we are in an environment where we have good, high quality air, then that will affect our body, our brain, and our energy in one way. And so being in an environment where we have good, high quality air tends to increase our energy and support our motivation. Now, there is so much that can be said about natural light. And I'm going to try to keep this conversation short, but it's something that I'm passionate about. And I wore my orange shirt today because Natural light is something that can affect our health, emotion, and motivation on so many levels. So, if part of our motivation challenge is energy, and if energy is connected to our poor sleep or lack of sleep, being exposed to natural light and artificial light might be one of the key things that can improve our sleep quality and unlock our energy. So we are on a circadian rhythm. We have a natural rhythm, and our exposure to sunlight helps to sync our hormones and chemical processes. One of the major sleep hormones is melatonin. And so our exposure to natural light and artificial light influences that sleep hormone. And so if we are having poor sleep, simply changing the environment that we spend time in can make a huge difference. As a society, we tend to spend less and less time outside and in natural light, and we tend to spend more and more time in front of screens and in front of artificial light. And so this is such a simple tweak that we can make that can change our energy, our health, our mood, and our motivation. Okay. So I'll just talk a little bit about the benefits of the sun. You may know that being exposed to sunlight can do a lot of good things. Being exposed to natural light can increase our testosterone, our dopamine, our serotonin, our vitamin D, and it can influence a ton of other processes in our bodies as well. But if we think about this from an emotional or a mood perspective, when our serotonin level is high, when our testosterone is high, when our dopamine is high, we're going to feel motivated. And some of you have heard of the disease SAD, seasonal affective disorder. And that is a disease associated with depression and low mood in the winter when we have a lack of exposure to sunlight. And so exposing ourselves to natural light is one way that our environment can have a significant effect on what happens in our body chemically, emotionally, and behaviorally. Okay. Now, in addition to affecting us physically and chemically, our environment can also affect us emotionally and behaviorally. Now, from an emotional perspective, I just mentioned that environment can affect our chemicals. And so sometimes environment increases our emotions just simply through a chemical change, serotonin, dopamine. But our environments can also influence us from a thinking perspective. And thinking affects our motivation through this mechanism. What we focus on and the story we tell about what we focus on affects our emotions and how we feel. So what we see in our environment can act as triggers for our thinking. Sometimes we may be in an environment and we see things that trigger hope and inspiration and energy and vitality. And sometimes we may be in environments that trigger a sense of despair or frustration or anger or uncertainty. And so what we see in our environment can affect our behavior because it may trigger certain thinking patterns. Now, this is also fascinating about environments. We often see people in our environments, and what we see people doing has a huge influence over our motivation to do certain behaviors as well. Now, I know many people pride themselves on not being sheep and not following the herd, but there are so many funny social conformity experiments out there where people do things just because they see other people in the environment doing it. And so again, our environments can affect us on many different ways. And what we see in our environment, it can affect our pattern of thinking and it can affect and influence our behavior. Okay. Last little thought about environment and affecting motivation. And I want to talk about how environment can affect us behaviorally. Environment can affect us behaviorally from an access perspective and from an environmental cue perspective. So first, access. There is a term in psychology called activation energy. And what activation energy simply means is that the easier it is to start a behavior, the more likely it is that we will be motivated to do it. The harder it is to start a behavior, the less likely we will be motivated to do it. So when we have access to certain things in our environment, that increases or decreases our motivation to go down that path and participate in that behavior. Now, I know that we can't always dramatically change our environments, but sometimes we can potentially tweak our environments so that we can make the access a little bit easier. As an example, many people will put their shoes in a spot where they can see them. And so it just makes it easier to access the shoes and get going. Some people will take their workout equipment and put it next to the TV so that it's just right there. It's just easier access to it. They don't have to go down into the basement. It's just right there. They can just grab it and go. So if you can find ways to adjust your environment to make it easier to access or easier to start behaviors, then that's one way that environment can support doing a behavior. Now, cues is similar to access. There's a phrase, out of sight, out of mind. And many people know that they can have good intentions in one moment, but then without having a visual cue, that thing is just kind of out of mind. And so some people use vision boards, some people use Post-it notes, some people use some type of cue from the environment to help them to be reminded of and motivated to do a certain behavior. All right, so motivation is complex, and I always just give a lot of different ideas so that potentially you might get some insight or aha about how you might be able to use some technique or tool to push yourself further down your own personal goal path. Before I go, I want to put on my coaching hat and ask a question. And the first question I want to ask is this, connected to environment. In what environment do you feel that you are motivated and energized to pursue a behavior that's important to you? Now, it could be any behavior. You may be thinking about mental activities like writing, reading, thinking, studying. And you might notice that, at home, I can study a little bit, but it's a little bit distracting. And so when I go to the office or to the library, that environment, I have more energy and motivation to focus on my mental work. Or it may be something physical. You may notice that when you're in a certain environment that you feel more energy to be physically active. So again, the question is, what environment do you notice when you place yourself in it? Your energy and your motivation changes for the better. Connected to this question, is there something that you can tweak about your environment to better support your energy and motivation to do whatever behavior is important to you to reach a certain goal? Now, I know we won't solve all the world's problems in one video, but I hope that by thinking about the connection between environment and behavior, it can help you to brainstorm and strategize about ways you might be able to place yourself in a favorable environment or tweak your current environment so that it supports your underlying motivation, energy, and desire. All right. I appreciate you, as always, for giving me so much of your time and attention. And I look forward to the next time we get a chance to talk about motivation. But until then, be well and take care.